man that Richard was talking about, I'm Yo-Yo Ma. This is the Silk Road Ensemble. Thank you, Richard. We're so glad to be at the TED conference. And from the earlier sessions today on technology and from last night from music, we really understand why so many of you are addicts and junkies of the TED conference. And we've been spending the last couple of hours imitating Richard, sort of getting up. And we're so afraid. So I've actually kept my watch on.
Don't be afraid.
Just so that,
Don't be afraid.
to avoid that. So this is something that,
I value my life. I'm not going to cut you off.
oh no, we value our lives. Okay, this is obviously not a cello. Right? Does anybody know what this is? What? Koto? Close, but no cigar. Not quite yet. This is a kemanche. It was given to me by the great kemanche player who's actually a member of our Silk Road Ensemble, Kean Kalhor, who comes from Tehran. And it's one of these instruments. I'm actually making my debut on it just now. So this is the very first time I'm playing it. And I love this instrument. You can find it in North Africa. You can find it in Central Asia. You can find it in the Middle East. You can find it, obviously, in Iran. You can find it. And it's such a beautiful instrument. I also think it's one of the precursors to the modern cello. And one of the reasons we chose the piece we just played for you is that it was written in 1492. Michael Hawley was speaking earlier about the importance of the year 1500 and what happened afterwards. So we thought this is, and we feel that way about our instruments also, because around that time, in 1492, all of the instruments that you hear or see here actually existed, were in the process of being born, as in the violin and the cello. You have the pipa, which maybe you can play a couple notes. Okay, the violin, which you want to play a couple notes. I don't know. Have you ever seen the violin before? Colin, this sounds suspiciously like the theremin that we heard last night. The tabla, which of course you... Erhu from China. Nice. Fabulous. And the shakuhachi from Japan. Beautiful. That's really amazing. Now, you might ask the following question. What are these guys doing playing all these strange instruments together? Well, I think I'm relating, 1492 or 1500 to our present time, because 1492 is important for a number of other reasons. Anybody know? Right, okay. Another reason, which I think was, and this is the reason we chose this piece, this was two shepherds singing to one another saying, you gotta go see this, Granada just fell. And that was the year that the Moors and the Jews were kicked out of Spain. And the composer was 24 years old. He was in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, and he wrote this piece. And so we thought that was an interesting moment because many new things were happening. A lot of new knowledge and a lot of movement of population. Somehow, an instrument like this remains because it is still being practiced. There are master musicians and practitioners and great audiences. For example, today, if you go and hear Mugam music where the Kimanche not just necessarily world music, but people from North Africa all the way through Central Asia, this instrument is known. And so I figured it's a good thing to know about it. We got together as the Silk Road Ensemble because we wanted to do something in the area of culture, but as a laboratory. It's like a cultural lab. And 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we did a lot of field work and discovered that there were, in fact, so many great musicians playing not just in Mongolia or in Iran or in Azerbaijan or in Syria, but actually in places like LA and New York and Cologne and Amsterdam, because there's been such a movement of people. And one of the things that since as a musician you have to travel, we're sort of like modern troubadours. I've spent the last 25 years playing professionally, which means that I've actually spent 13 years on the road. And for those of you that travel, you know that you discover new things, and actually people show you what is precious to them. And in the field of cultural work, one of the things we think a lot about is, if I know what is precious to you, and you know what's precious to me, when we meet, when strangers meet, you actually might have a different kind of conversation. So it's not about, where do you live, where were you born, where, how many brothers and sisters you have. You actually know something. You start out from a different vantage point. And we sort of think of that as a form of trust, because if you have that kind of exchange, you can actually build on it. If you don't, it's really easily dissipated. So that's one of the things that we talk about. Another thing we ask ourselves a lot is, can you combine old knowledge and new knowledge? Hard thing to do. Again, I was very touched by what Michael Hawley talked about this morning, because on the one hand, all of what's happening in new knowledge is the tip of the iceberg, and on the other hand, he was personally committed to going to Cambodia and to Bhutan, and actually people in Bhutan feel what we go through here, but do we feel also what people are going through in Bhutan? And so that's the kind of exchange that we're sort of thinking a lot about, because in today's world, another question we ask ourselves is, do we know who our neighbors are? Again, so many people are moving around. We as musicians, obviously, we do move around. You all move around. The question is, do we know who actually live in our community? And whether, so that's one of those questions that we're trying to address through music, because one of the things that I think we believe in as musicians is that it's one of the best ways to codify our inner lives. So it's really hard to measure what your inner life is, but you all have one, and you use it constantly to make decisions and whatever. And we sort of measure how much we can code something by the trust or the authenticity of what gets back to us in whatever we try to do. And it's an experiment, because sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes it works better, and we're constantly trying to move forward. So that's short for what we try to do. Some of the answers we found to those questions. What happens when, what happens if you go very deeply into the local? Do we know who our neighbors are? If you go deeply into the local, we sort of have found, you find a version of the global. And we have found by going through history, you have had globalization in many, many ways. Silk Road as an internet of antiquity, Aleppo, Bukhara, Tbilisi, Tashkent, obviously Istanbul, Constantinople, but many, many cities that were very, Xi'an around the Tang Dynasty, 1 million people, Jews, Africans, Arabs, Christians, all lived together in a tolerant society. And the question is, what can we do today to kind of do something that seems to make sense in more than one place? So one of the things we discovered is if you go deeply into the local, you find the global. However, what Walt Mossberg said this morning, he can be talking to James Baker and saying, I'm going to computers, and he says, why the fuck are you doing this? Sorry, that's a quote. It's a diplomatic quote, okay? And so one of the things we discovered is that you can find the global, but actually people want to actually remake it into the local. So one such example, you take the pipa. You're Yang Wei. You come from where?
Originally from Shanghai, China, and now
I think is it on?
and now live in Chicago.
Okay, so an example of this. Now tell us about, so the pipa is what?
The pipa is a pluck instrument.
Good, thanks a lot. I really appreciate that. It's in China. Does it come from China?
No, it's import from Persia, maybe, probably.
From Persia? It used to be the oud, which is a Middle Eastern or Central Asian instrument. And how was it held? This way or on a 45-degree angle. By the time it got to China, after 1,000 years, they changed positions, essentially. And the oud also went to Europe. And it became the lute. And so the pipa can sound like a lute. I will kill him later for appropriating the cello repertoire. This is a cello piece. There will be damage. So you have an instrument that has transnational roots. In China, it's known as the pipa. In Japan, it's the biwa. And actually, I'm not just talking off the top of my head. In Japan, in the Imperial Museum, there's one example of a pipa from around the year 800, which is when Buddhism arrived. It has 5 strings. No pipas with 5 strings exist anymore. You can see it in the caves of Dunhuang. There's an image of a pipa with 5 strings. But what's interesting about that pipa is at the biwa, is that there are 2 stones from East Africa. There's a leather painting with a Persian man, a Chinese landscape, and how did it get there? That's sort of an interesting factoid, and it may just end there, except we think that we started looking at many of the traditions that may exist. For example, the shakuhachi is a quintessentially Japanese instrument. You've seen that, Ko? Ko, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you, and why do you play this instrument?
My name is Umezaki Kojiro, and my father is Japanese from the southern part of Japan, and my mother is from the borderlands between Denmark and Germany, which explains their hair, I imagine.
It's got great hair.
The reason, it's obviously very complicated, but we're in an interesting time with this instrument. As you might imagine, there was a long period over the last 100 years where a lot of the traditional forms in Japan were kind of being swept under the carpet for modernization, to be replaced by sort of ideas of modernization. And for me, growing up in Japan during the 70s and 80s, it was an interesting time where you go out on the street and everybody's telling you you're a foreigner, and yet, when you're a kid, things are kind of black and white, and you don't understand you have a Japanese passport, but, look at that gaijin over there. And probably the reason why I'm playing the shakuhachi is because I wanted to get connected much more directly to Japanese tradition, which ironically wasn't really the mainstream thing for kids my age to do, of course.
Will you play some more for us?
Sure, absolutely.
Let's stand up. Thank you, Ken. As you could tell, the shakuhachi is not a party instrument. But when you play it, I think we suddenly become a little calmer, and it's used in Buddhist rituals as a meditation instrument, an instrument for meditation, and actually its cousin, the ney, in Islam is used for exactly the same purposes. So different religions, but same spiritual purpose. So that's, we thought it would be interesting to show that. And in fact, when Ko played with Ilham on the ney, who's from Azerbaijan, and Siamek from Tehran, they had these 3 flutes going, and they could actually, you made instant music together that made beautiful sense. And I think in terms of talking about trust, even though there was actually not at that time a common language, you actually could talk, not because music is an international language, but because certain very specific characteristics were there that you could go deeply into. It's not a feel-good, homogeneous, let's make music together. It's actually a very specific thing. I think you got into a quite deep place. And that's one thing that can happen. Another thing that we do, when Keihan wrote a piece for us, it was for strings and this instrument, santur, and ney, and tabla. And it was actually, we thought it sounded good, but it wasn't quite right. And here's another thing that sometimes you have to work out in order to develop, to get inside something. I think the primary goal is how do you jump in, get inside something, and to start to grow from there. I think we had trouble with a scale. The scale was okay, that's a scale that we thought, in tempered pitch, it would be fine to play. It was written down. We had the information, but we didn't have the knowledge of something else until we were shown that actually we need to play this way. Different sound, right? Sounds out of tune. Okay, so actually, before every time we play, because we were not accustomed to it both internally as well as physically, by getting that scale inside us, suddenly what we played sounded right. So you have those kinds of figures that actually make something into Persian music. That's at least one component. Tell us, Shane, maybe you can tell us a little bit. Where are you? Shane, can you, if I give you a mic. Now, for percussion instruments, all these percussion instruments existed in 1500, but maybe you can speak to us a little bit as to what are some of the common rhythms that you may have found in different parts of the world.
Yes, in our studies of different musics from different parts of the world, we found that certain rhythms are very, very prominent. And one in particular is taking a grouping of 8 notes, which is very commonly divided into 4 plus 4 and even 4 plus 4. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But a lot of cultures take this same grouping of 8 and divide it into 3 plus 3 plus 2, which totally changes the feel of this same 8-note grouping. So you get 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And so these different cultures play that exact same rhythm, but in different ways on different instruments. In India, for example, it's played on the tabla to accompany vocal music. And if you ever heard the great Qawwali singer Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, you've heard this rhythm played on the tabla. And it's called Sitar Khani, and it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And then when we see this same rhythm actually in the Middle East, and when we go to the Middle East, of course, the instruments change, and we get a very different sound. But in the Middle East, this same rhythm is used to accompany belly dance music, and it sounds a little bit different because we also have an ensemble of 3 percussionists playing exactly the same rhythm together, and it sounds like this. Sort of a flirtation between men and women, and their approach to it is different. Again, it's an ensemble of drummers playing using this same 3-3-2 rhythm as a basis, but instead of playing in unison, there are different rhythms layered on top of it that make it sort of more complicated and intricate rhythmically.
Using that same idea, we moved to Brazil, same kind of rhythmic figure, and we add more members to the ensemble, a more polyphonic sound to the rhythm. And this rhythm actually is called baião from the northern part of Brazil in Salvador. It sounds like this.
And if you go, can you do one?
And then finally, if we move to Cuba, there's a rhythm that is extrapolated from that, the 3-2 clave, which has that same figure. And this rhythm mostly comes from West Africa, and now you hear it a lot in popular music and in soul music from Cuba. It sounds like this.
And if you take it to New York, you might hear something like this. Gershwin. You talked about a flirtation rhythm. This is a sensuality component. I know we're getting, I'm really worried about this. We're going to move on to the next piece because the next piece is a flirtation song. Comes from mountain people, sing and dance as part of their daily rituals, like Bali, and there's a love song embedded in the middle of the flirtation song, and it's played by a special instrument called the bawu, and which is used between lovers. So. Thank you. Do we have a couple minutes?
Maybe about 15 minutes. Take
We
your
still
time.
have 15 minutes? We still have a couple minutes.
Yeah,
Is
take
that
your
okay?
time. Yes.
I'm so worried. I'm so worried. Okay. Look, now, I hope this is interesting to you because I wanted to just very briefly take you a little bit through what this is about. Describe the cello a little bit. This is a Venetian cello made in 1733. And Colin, your violin is made when?
1696.
Okay.
Cremona.
In Cremona. Now, those two cities were sort of competitors, sort of like Silicon Valley and, you know, I don't know, there's no competition. I didn't say that. There is no competition. Anyway, what's interesting, actually, not unlike Silicon Valley, where I hear that the people who actually make the companies, the technologists, as well as the investors, often live within a short distance of each other. I think what happened is between 1600 and around 1730, all the great makers in Cremona all lived and worked, their workshops were on the same street. So what's happening is that you have an intergenerational thing going on, and you also have competition. Obviously, my instrument is better than yours, or it's different, or whatever, but there's a complete sharing of knowledge. And what happened is that you actually got, today you all know what a Stradivarius is, because somehow it got to a point where people who just, you know, don't care about violins or cellos know that Stradivarius means something. It got to a certain golden period. And that's one of the things we try, that's kind of interesting because actually Venice was in competition with Genoa, right? The two great ports, and Cremona drew from Genoa and Venice drew from other places. And I actually have something, when I was last in Cremona, a young man, a violin maker, gave me this. He says, "Did you know this?" I said, "I don't know, what is this?" He says, "On your cello, the Montagnana, the lacca veneziana, Venetian varnish, these are 5 of the components that's in the varnish. Sangue de drago, dragon's blood from Malaysia. Kukurma, curry from India. Goma lacca from Ceylon in Sri Lanka. Mastiche in Nakrine from Lebanon. Goma arabica from acacia trees in the desert in the Middle East." So this varnish, and people have written about it. You see scientific American articles about the varnish, the secret of Strad, of Montagnana, of Guarnerius. It's, you know, how did it get there? It's kind of interesting. And one of the things, so that's that's something where materials actually made a big difference, and obviously what we talked about, the proximity and all of this. Now, you saw, I'm going to move this over a little bit. Now, Betty, how do you play the erhu? Okay, so you can see from Betty's hand motion, you play it this way. How do you play the violin?
This way.
Okay, now this is really a very little thing, right? Before 1500, every bowed instrument, the erhu, the kemanche, this Mongolian horsehead fiddle, nomadic instrument. Also, you play this way. It's out of tune, so I'm not going to play it. But basically, this is an 18th century bow. It has fancy screws so you can tighten it. And if you didn't have the screws, what do? You use your fingers. Right, you have a modern version, you have an updated version of a bow. But this is what people did in nomadic as well as sedentary cultures before you have certain technology that makes it simpler. Another example, I think, is, and I will get to these in 1 second, is that materials keep changing. Before 1700 something, people played the cello without an end pin. So you'd be, playing like this, and you're bow-legged because you're walking like this. And then someone decided it's going to be easier to put this in. And so these are some tailpieces now, plastic or metal. Why? Because people want one thing. The need was for the richest sound possible. And in richest acoustic sound possible. At that time, popularization of music, 1,000-seat halls, you want something that carries. So every technological invention, gut strings to steel strings, arch of the bridge, everything was for bigger, richer sound. And it got until one moment when, actually what happened, electrification of music. Suddenly, 2,800-seat halls, Moshe, you know more about than I do, Frank, you know more about than I do, that you can have bigger halls because you don't need to worry about this anymore. But things kept developing because people keep coming up with new materials just so that you can have more precise sound or whatever. But what happens in this segment in terms of change and evolution, you can have devolution. I don't want to use this word because it has other meanings. But in terms of devolving an instrument, 10 years ago, I would not have been able to play with Young Wei or Betty or Ko because I was trained to play stuff like with big sound that you spend years training for to get. But then, by working with, in Baroque music, fiddle music, where you suddenly have to develop new techniques. Where the value is not vibrato, rich sound, but it's a different kind of precision. In terms of the trust that we talk about, it took about a year for my colleagues to say, okay, what you're doing sounds almost good. And I thought I was okay. And a series of evolution of actually going into Piazzolla tango music took me into another area, and finally we could come back to a 1500 time period where we can actually talk together and be able to, and the instruments can speak, and with the help of technology, because if we were doing this in a larger hall, actually the mics will allow for the different acoustic levels to be absolutely there for us. And I think, so that's the change part in terms of instruments. This is a sensuality panel, and the one thing I'd like to say about that is that when we play, first of all, we can't make a note of music unless we trust one another. And the second thing is that what we use in terms of not contextual or societal or instrumental changes that sometimes are hard to deal with, in terms of yourself, in terms of what you use to make music, you use all your senses. In fact, what I think makes it really neat for all of us is that when we're using ourselves to the utmost physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, tactily, in terms of memory of what we have, what we think is precious and what we go for, you get to an internal aesthetic. And it's a state of mind that I think exists both in sensuality as well as in music. So the last piece we'd like to play for you, to honor that part of it, is a piece that's also written, whoops. Okay, you can give him an instrument, but he'll step on it. Also written in around 1500, and the title of it is What Happens on the Street. So imagine a port city and our reimagination of a port city, and the words are actually?
The words talk about show yourself. In other words, a guy is walking on the street in front of a balcony, and he says he wants someone to show themselves, or else he will die. And
A young lady.
a young lady, in other words, yeah. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's so what happens when strangers meet? And this is one of the things that can happen as we have met. Okay, go. so scared of Richard that I forgot to introduce 2 instruments, and then I'd actually like to play something for Richard because this is our first conference, but it's your last one. But I'd just like to say, for one thing, that means you can't fire us, you know? What happens when new technology arrives that instead of spruce and maple, and if you were to play this, as we will at the Washington Mall at the Smithsonian for the Folklife Festival in June, it's 100 degrees out there and it's 99.9% humidity. You can't play one of these instruments. A guy from the Boston Symphony spent a couple of years, a number of years, a lot of time, a lot of support from Richard, Louis Leguia, and we have people here who actually also supported him. Carbon fiber instrument. Can you hold this for a second? You know, actually, it arrived in a box, so the bridge was broken, but actually I tell you, it's a wonderful sounding instrument. Another instrument that actually the value, it's not an inexpensive instrument, but it's 100,000% less than the value of an older Cremonese or Venetian instrument. 100,000%. A silent cello from Yamaha, which actually, if you, again, for a student, actually Yamaha has donated this, a number of instruments to places that are far away, for kids that actually would find great use for this, and I don't know if you can turn it on. You actually, again, it can be silent, or you could plug it into a speaker, and it's actually better for certain types of digital recording, and so this is another development in. Okay, I'm not going to break anything, but I would like to actually play a little piece for Richard, because this is your last. It's a piece by Bach, and it's a work, since you are an information architect. A number of years ago, Moshe and I did something, a film on this piece, on Piranesi. Another person that we had discussions on what kind of architect or what he was. And actually this piece, we think of Bach as a German composer. This is a saraband, which actually from that suite, which actually came through Moorish Spain. And it used to be a lewd and lascivious dance. So I guess, you know, in some ways it refers to this panel, but by the time it came to the French court, it became very courtly. But it's a little wistful, but here is the saraband from the second suite, okay?
maybe I've talked this all down from that emotional moment. Christy
Thank you.
Hefner again. Go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. I appreciate both the invitation and the transition, since I don't think one should be asked to ruminate about anything after listening to those sounds. But that is my assignment. And on that opening
I've had a
act,
lot of gas pains. What was that? Was it me? Oh.
uh-oh.
Mike Bates, do we need you? No, that
Okay.
isn't Mike's.
Is my microphone still on? Okay. Richard asked me to be on a panel about design of sensuality, and having never been to a TED conference before, as other presenters have mentioned, you get a certain amount of coaching, but not a lot of specifics. So I knew enough, and this was certainly underscored by the multiple times I've been told the Martha Stewart story. Thank you. Not to give a corporate presentation. So what I thought I would try and do is to share some thoughts that I have put together over the last weeks in anticipation of today about sensuality and design, drawing, not surprisingly, from my sense of Playboy's role in the culture and my sense of my father and of myself. And by way of backdrop, particularly because, as Richard points out when he talks about the 1,000 most creative people in America, there is, in spite of the world orchestra that just performed for us, something of an American focus here. Just to set the stage a little bit in terms of sensuality in this country right before Playboy was launched, it's important, I think, to remember, for those of us that were just born then or weren't born then, that our country didn't have, to put it mildly, much of a tradition of sensuality. I think that'd be fair to say. I mean, you could think of the Kama Sutra and the fabulous erotic art of Japan, and you can think of everything about the European lifestyle in terms of food and wine and the romance of the road and art. And our heritage, in contrast, kind of comes down to the Puritans. And as has been said, the reason the Puritans hated bear baiting was not because it was cruel to the animal, but because the spectators were having too damn much fun. So we have this kind of sense, historically, to the extent we have a brief history of kind of idle hands or the devil's plaything. The devil is in the flesh. And we have a set of laws as well as attitudes from our early days that are not just anti-sexual, but I would argue actually perhaps even more profoundly kind of suspicious of pleasure. And that was reflected a lot in the culture, in the popular culture, from the Hayes Act to the twin beds on television shows to, not showing Elvis below the waist on Ed Sullivan. And that was the culture into which my father bore Playboy. And in thinking about today, I was thinking, did I feel that he was compelled to be a magazine editor and publisher? And I've never actually talked to him about this, but I don't think the answer to that is yes. I think he was compelled to carry a message, and the canvas that he chose was partly the magazine and partly his life. And I think he was and is, as good editors are, both a designer and a marketer. And I think he was and is a brilliant designer and marketer of both a magazine and of his life. I happen to have been an English major and have a great fondness for print, and am a casual student of magazines. And I think magazines, at their best, can do three different things, and sometimes two or three of them. One is they can be a window onto the world. So my father grew up with Life magazine, which was truly a window to the world. Vogue is that, Sports Illustrated is that. They can also be an attitude. That's what the New Yorker is, that's what Ms. is. But sometimes, because I think magazine publishing is the most personal form of mass communication, frequently magazines are started by visionaries and entrepreneurs whose goal is, as my father's was, as simple as make enough money to keep publishing it so you don't have to get a real job. They can be actually sort of the personification of an individual, as Playboy clearly is, as Cosmopolitan was under Helen Gurley Brown, as O is today, Oprah's magazine. And I think as Hef saw the magazine at the beginning, he came to it with this philosophy or purpose, as I mentioned. And that philosophy, I think, was deeply rooted in the themes, as I understand them, of the portion of this program that is devoted to sensuality, because it was about, as powerfully as breaking through the 1984 commercial demonstrated in its way, denying the old-fashioned split between the mind and body and putting them back together again, and creating and celebrating a lifestyle. And in 1953, that wasn't a word, so it was kind of an interesting idea. And at the heart of that lifestyle, I think, was a very profound celebration of sensuality. And that celebration of sensuality is reflected very significantly in the content and context of the magazine, particularly in its sort of first 20 years, in lots of different ways. Part of what I think sensuality is about is both innocence and provocativeness, and the combination of those two things, which I think is a part of the power of Hef's genius in putting them together. Part of it is about romance, and in being here the last day and a half and seeing the panel on cars, for example, I thought about that in the context of the romance of the road, which was and has always been a staple of the magazine. And part of it is about mood. And I think, and I know we're doing Space and Place next, but I think about sort of Playboy's take on the idea that the pad, as it was called then, but your home was all about using design and technology to set the mood. And that idea of mood and sensuality was really critical in the context for the sexuality of the magazine. Now, the laugh line about the magazine, one of the laugh lines about the magazine is always, I buy it for the articles. And of course, embedded in that is the notion that, well, actually, the singular reason why young men buy the magazine is for the photographs. And I'm quite sure it's the predominant reason young men buy the magazine, because it's the predominant interest young men have. But that notion of reductionism misses something far more important than marketing surveys about Playboy, and that is the idea of how much more powerful sexuality and sensuality are when linked. And I talked about the pre-Playboy period as being a period which was kind of repressive about both sexuality and sensuality, and I want to end with my observations about where we are now, which is a very different, but in my mind, not necessarily less troubling place. But even the idea of the centerfold and the playmate was very much driven by this notion that there was a story, that this was the girl next door, that nice girls liked sex too. There was the, sort of cliched photo of the playmate making spaghetti with her mom in the kitchen. But in reality, for the men of my father's generation who grew up with the magazine, their sense of these women as people was profound. So part of the canvas for my father was the magazine itself, and a lot of his execution of editor as designer, I think, goes back to the fact that, just because that is sort of who he is, he was always visual and always a designer. The magazine, among its less lauded, but I think most significant contributions, broadly speaking, was to completely break the barrier that had existed before that between fine art and illustration, and to bring to the visualization of fiction and nonfiction as much artistry as was in the text. And that was very much his sensibility. There are a lot of sort of icons of Playboy's history that when I was thinking about this panel, I thought, gee, those are actually really interestingly designed elements. I was at the chair panel, so I know that there is work going on as we sit here around the idea of a 24-hour chair, and I wanted to raise my hand, but I know we're not allowed to do that, to say, I think my dad invented that. It was the round bed. But in fact, I actually was thinking during the chair panel that, wasn't it interesting that when my parents were married, which wasn't for very many years, but did include my first couple of years of life, and I was born a year before the magazine was born, that in their South Side apartment, and my dad was a copywriter, so they weren't living on very much money. They just moved out of his parents' house because they had a baby. They had a Henry Miller dining room set and an Eames chair, which was actually way cool and clearly suggested a sort of sensibility that he then brought. This is not a corporate story, so I'm not going to talk about the history of the company, except to note, because I think it's important and I'll come back to it, that in designing and marketing his life as an expression of this celebration of sensuality, I think he was particularly shrewd in understanding that it was important to make it accessible to the readers. And so in the early years, that was in the form of lavish photo displays in the magazine of life at the mansion, but it ultimately became the TV show and then the clubs. And I think that idea of the balance between the private and the public side of sensuality is one of the most challenging and interesting elements of sensuality for anybody that's in the entertainment and media businesses, and something that now much more contemporaneously we wrestle with all the time. When I came into the company, I came in obviously as the next generation, and I came in, at least I took over at a time that was after the sexual revolution. And a lot of the conventional wisdom about Playboy after the sexual revolution, when Penthouse and Hustler and all these explicit magazines had come on the scene, and not long after that, people, Deep Throat and X-rated movies were accessible, at least in movie theaters, and then really accessible through home video, was that Playboy was kind of going to be the victim of its own success, because why would people buy Playboy anymore? And that led to an interesting re-questioning of this premise that I have, which is that sensuality and sexuality, when combined, are infinitely more powerful and infinitely, frankly, more commercial. And I think that the magazine's survival of that period would be one small testimony to that. But something else happened in that period that was actually more challenging, I think, for life at Playboy, and that was that I came of age in the heyday of the beginning of the feminist movement. And in its origins, at least as I experienced it, it was actually a very powerful second movement, like the sexual revolution, that was complementary to Playboy's original vision, because it came of age in the late 60s and early 70s at a time when it was very pro-sexual. Our Bodies Ourselves, Erica Jong, a lot of erotic art being done by women. And it, in its own way, from its own voice as women, was speaking to the idea that you didn't have to have this Madonna-whore dichotomy that was the old American heritage, but you really could celebrate the idea that, yes, indeed, nice girls liked sex too. But out of the women's movement came two strains that are with us today that are not so much impacting on the amount of sexuality in the culture, but I do think they impact on the amount of sensuality in the culture. One of those was women as business people and the legacy of, I'm sad to say, the kind of, dress for success, masculinization of women. And the other was the focus on women as sexual victims and women's need to sort of take back the night. You wouldn't be taken seriously if you at all indulged your sexuality and femininity. I remember when I was at Brandeis, I got elected to Phi Beta Kappa in my junior year, and when I changed my last name back to Hefner that summer because my mother had divorced from a very unhappy second marriage, and I dropped my stepfather's last name, in part because I had this certificate from Phi Beta Kappa that I thought, this is really important to me, I would like my father's name on it. So I was walking on the campus and this dean came up to me and said, "You're Christy Hefner, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Congratulations, I see you were elected to Phi Beta Kappa." And I said, "Thank you very much." And he did this sort of double take and he said, "And you're so pretty." And the obvious message was how odd, that you would be, sort of academically skilled and attractive. And it spoke to the time that I came of age in the movement, which was a time in which we didn't think for one damn minute that you had to trade off between being, bright and attractive, powerful and sexy, that we were going to sort of do it all and have it all. But that more inclusive sense of the movement for my generation, I think got subsumed by some of the other elements of both power in the corporate world and in terms of the balance of communications between the sexes. And at its worst, what it's done is it's made seduction really hard in a world in which in the workforce, everybody's nervous about what harassment is, and on the campus, everybody's nervous about the codes of behavior. The whole idea of seduction that's so integral to sensuality becomes suspect and risky and not as easily explored or celebrated. Now, ironically, having said all of that, that's not, in fact, I think the dynamic that is today's dynamic, either as I see it as the CEO of a brand that celebrates sensuality or just as an observer, because time marches on and there's now a third generation of readers of the magazine, that generation after me. And it's a very different generation in its attitudes and frankly doesn't find the suspiciousness about sensuality or specifically sexuality at all challenging. In fact, it's very embracing of sexuality. But in a funny way, its comfort with sexuality and the media's acceptance of nudity and sexuality in ways that would have been shocking 10 years ago. And I don't mean by the media adult movies, I mean HBO and Showtime and MTV and music covers, is that the culture, it seems to me, is one in which we've sort of traded a culture of sensuality that is about subtlety and suggestiveness and promise for a culture that's kind of about sensory overload and bombardment. That part of what sensuality is, and it was interesting when Yo-Yo Ma made the comment about this is not a party instrument, it's about patience, and we're a culture of instant gratification. So if the Beach Boys sang, "Wouldn't it be nice if we were older, then we wouldn't have to wait so long," and today 14-year-olds are in after-school oral sex clubs, that's a big difference in terms of where the world has shifted. And if the working assumption of a lot of people, I think, when Playboy was started was that if we could get less hung up about sex, it would be a more sensual culture as well, has not necessarily automatically happened. I just saw the new Viagra ad, and I thought it was fascinating that this product, which is essentially about our sexuality is being promoted with a race car. I don't know. I mean, if that's our most potent symbol for, the idea of great sexuality, I think we've lost the mind-body idea here. I think the most powerful aspects of sensuality is that it's about images that elicit feelings that prompt desire. And that's not the same as showing the results of desire. And in the MTV culture, the nod to sensuality would be like a nanosecond image of a mouth. That would be your, okay, let me touch that button. And then you would go on to much bolder, more graphic images. And the point here isn't about explicitness or graphicness. The point really, because I think things can be quite explicit and quite sensual and quite non-explicit and quite non-sensual, is really about this idea of suggestiveness and subtlety and coyness. Now, to finish with the arc of where that took Playboy. So Playboy had this challenge because here was this new generation that, unlike Hef, who grew up on the movies of the 30s, and Cole Porter, grew up on, MTV. And for the magazine to stay connected to the youngest readers, which is essential, it had to kind of reinvent itself. And in fact, it has done that. And Richard asked me to send some magazines over, and I think they're somewhere around. So if you haven't looked at the magazine in a while, it will seem both familiar, but it should seem contemporary in a way that your memory of it might be different. And that's the use of more photography and less illustration because it's more impactful and more immediate. That's a different pacing. That's a greater sense of information and less fantasy, greater sense of usability, a different pace. And all those things are probably the right things, and certainly if you look at the continued dominance of the magazine in terms of overall readership and college age and all of that, it's working. But it does come at a cost, and the magazine is less coy and less suggestive and different than it was because it has to compete in a culture that's different than it was. And we've tried to take those contemporary values and marry them with the sensuality of the heart of Playboy and move it forward in two ways. And those two ways are electronic and as a brand. And what I would just say about those two strategies in a cultural sense is that television is absolutely about instant gratification. So we had to compress the idea of the brand and squeeze it to become really about sexy entertainment all the time. But we did gain something when we gave that up, and that was we moved into a medium where we could create content for couples, not just for guys. And that's been really interesting. On the brand side, what we have done, just to put it in a broader culture, is to try and recognize that as we move outside the US, the brand has this power that is not just beauty and style, but also freedom. And so what we're trying to do is find the places that in this culture, for this generation, resonate for the brand to be the sensual brand, such that if the brand is the theme park, we figure out the products that people will buy as souvenirs of that experience. So those are my thoughts to share with you today. Thank you.
Since the video. And I'm not going to make this a Weight Watchers kind of thing, how it was done, but I think it's important for somebody like myself who has such a great love of food to explain that that was my form of lovemaking. There wasn't anything that didn't pass through the portals of these lips. It's kind of interesting that I follow Playboy because the thing that's odd about Playboy is that the girls are so perfect that you see, we love women that are not like that. We love the women who are sensual because they have imperfections and they're real. And there's got to be something tied in with the food and the sex, because obviously this is probably the most repressed society. And, you know, I'm fond of saying I'm very good in bed because I practice a lot when I'm alone. But that's not Neil Simon, I think that's Woody Allen. But anyway, in this video, I think I weigh 335 pounds. But honestly, I really didn't know that. I mean, I'd look in the mirror, and I just didn't see somebody that size. And, you know, it was my job. I have all these restaurants, I got to try the food. That was my excuse. You know, I'd kid myself, I'm wearing my prosperity. But the reality is that you start feeling really terrible at some point. And I'm a young man. And it finally dawned on me as my relationships with people in both business and also my personal relationships started to deteriorate, that the common denominator was me, and that I had to make a change, but I couldn't. I couldn't break from the habit of going into the bakery and eating all the bread products, and I couldn't break from the habit of cheeseburgers and greasy Chinese food and sushi, which has sugar in the rice, by the way, and chocolate and all that good stuff. So what I needed was intervention. I needed somebody to take over, you know, just like if I were dying. But that wasn't going to happen because that just doesn't really happen in life. So I was very fortunate that a friend of mine who had talked to me once about the Mayo Clinic said, you really got to go to the Mayo Clinic. And I figured, well, maybe that's exactly what I need. I need to get into a plane, I need to go to a hospital, and they're going to tell me I'm dying from colon cancer or something else has happened to me. That's really, you know, I have diabetes, and then I'll stop. And essentially what happened was I went to the Mayo Clinic, and they put you through all these tests, and it's really a phenomenal place, although it's a little depressing to go to Minnesota. And I hope there's nobody from Minnesota here. And at the end of 2 full days of being probed and scoped and watching yourself on screens, essentially, I was healthy for an obese fat guy. My cholesterol even wasn't that terrible. But I realized after those 2 days that it was really not a place I wanted to be. And I got back to New York, and I don't know what happened, but it was the first time, and I haven't been fat my whole life, but I've been fat probably the last 12 years, very fat. And I got back to New York, and I just said, I'm going to intellectualize food. I know enough about food that I can find the things that I can eat, that are safe to eat, that are enjoyable, and see if that can change my eating habit a little bit. And I have all these restaurants, and guess what? The biggest motivation was, it's all free. It's like a kid in a candy store. You can go into any of these places and you just eat. And that's one of the reasons why obviously I got into trouble. But anyway, the bottom line is that I started to eat just pure things, like just tomatoes, or just steamed asparagus, or just freshly opened oysters, or just a piece of fish completely raw and pristine, no rice, sashimi, no sushi. And the weight just started to melt off. It was 60 pounds in 60 days. And you know, I saw it, but I'd go out and I'd be like trying to show people, and you know, they'd say, oh yeah, I see it in your face. And meanwhile, I want them to say, I see it in your ass. But then I lost another 40 pounds in about 80 days, so that was 100 pounds. And then obviously, you know, I was getting so much affirmation about, oh my God, look at the way you look and the way you change. And my sex life improved, obviously. I could see it again. And let's just say this about sex. You know, the thing about Viagra, if Bob Dole is doing commercials, then we all got to have hope that, you know, we can still be performing in our later years, you know? But the bottom line with the whole thing was that, you know, food I used as a narcotic of sorts. I used it to sedate myself at night. I used it as an excuse not to live up to my potential. Business unusual, right? No office. I don't even know how to drive a fucking car. All those cars down there are unbelievable. I know about computers through my 14-year-old son. And I'm not proud of those things. But Ted, I think, to me, is to educate Drew. So it's kind of a good thing that I came. I want everyone to do me a big favor. Nobody asked me for the private line at Nobu, because Richard's got it. And I want to just say that it's really been a pleasure being here. It's been an eye-opening experience, and thank you for including me.
I had a terrific dinner at Nobu the other night with Drew and our next speaker, David Rockwell. Man, that's a good restaurant. Okay, David. David? And David is going to talk also with a Tedster of many years, Kurt Anderson. We need an extra chair, huh? Can I grab one of these waters? Sure. You can grab one of those waters, and we need another chair. You all know Kurt Anderson? David Rockwell.
Like many architects, David is both a hog for the limelight, but is sufficiently reticent, or at least pretends to be, that he asked me to question him rather than speaking. And in fact, what we're going to talk about, I think, is in fact a subject that is probably better served by a conversation than an address. And I guess we have a bit of news clip to proceed.
Right.
Okay.
Since the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, many people have flocked to downtown New York to see and pay respects at what amounts to the 16-acre burial ground. Now, as CBS's Jim Axelrod reports, they're putting the finishing touches on a new way for people to visit and view the scene.
Forget the Empire State Building or the Statue of Liberty. There's a new place in New York where the crowds are thickest. Ground Zero.
Taking my stepdaughter here from Indianapolis. This was, out of all the tourist sites in New York City, this was her #1 pick.
Thousands now line up on Lower Broadway.
I've been wanting to come down here since this happened.
Even on the coldest winter days, to honor and remember.
It's reality. It's us. It happened here. This is ours.
So many, in fact, that seeing has become a bit of a problem.
I think that people are very frustrated that they're not able to get closer to see what's going on.
But that is about to change. In record time, a team of architects and construction workers designed and built a viewing platform to ease the frustration and bring people closer.
They'll get an incredible panorama and understand, I think, more completely the sheer totality of the destruction of the place.
If you think about it, Ground Zero is unlike most any other tourist site in America. Unlike the Grand Canyon or the Washington Monument, people come here to see what's no longer there.
First experience people will have here when they see this is not as a construction site, but as an incredibly moving burial ground.
The walls are bare by design, so people can fill them with their own memorials, the way they already have along the current perimeter.
From our hearts to their heart, it affected us just as much.
The ramps are made of simple material, the kind of plywood you see at construction sites, which is really the whole point. In the face of America's worst destruction, people are building again. Jim Axelrod, CBS News, New York.
This is not obviously an obvious subject to be in the sensuality segment, but certainly, David, you are known as, I know a phrase you hate, an entertainment architect. You are known, your work is highly sensual, even hedonistic.
I like that word.
Okay. It's about pleasure.
You just get here?
Casinos and hotels and restaurants.
You missed the
How did the shock that all of us, and especially all of us in New York, felt on the 11th of September transmute into your desire to do this thing?
Well, the truth of the matter is, post-September 11th, I felt myself in the role originally, first of all, as someone who lives in Tribeca and whose neighborhood was devastated, and as someone who works less than a mile from there, that I was in the role of forcing 100 people who work with me in my firm to continue to have the same level of enthusiasm about creating the places we had been creating. In fact, we're finishing a book which is called Pleasure, which is about sensual pleasure in spaces. But I've got to tell you, it became impossible to do that. We were really paralyzed. And I found myself the Friday after September 11th, 2 days afterwards, literally unable to motivate anyone and to do anything. We gave the office a few days off. And in discussing this with other architects, we had seen people saying in the press that they should rebuild the towers as they were, they should rebuild them 50 stories taller. And I thought it was astonishing to speculate as if this were a competition on something that was such a fresh wound. And had a series of discussions, first with Rick Scafidio and Liz Diller, who collaborated with us on this, and several other people, and really felt like we had to find relevance in doing something. And that as people who create places, the ultimate way to help wasn't to pontificate or to make up scenarios, but to help right now. So we tried to come up with a way as a group to have a kind of design SWAT team. And that was the mission that we came up with.
Were you conscious of suddenly, as a designer whose work is all about fulfilling wants, suddenly fulfilling needs?
Well, what I was aware of was there was this overwhelming need to act now. And we were asked to participate in a few projects before this, and there was a school, PS 234, that had been evacuated down at Ground Zero. They moved to an abandoned school. We took about 20 or 30 architects and designers and artists, and over 4 days it was like this urban barn raising to renovate it, and everyone wanted to help. It was just extraordinary. Tom Otterness contributed, Myra Kelman contributed, and it became this cathartic experience for us.
And that was done effectively 3 weeks by October 8th or something.
Yeah.
Obviously what you faced in trying to do something as substantial as this project, and this is only one of 4 that you've designed to surround the site, you must have run up against the incredibly Byzantine, entrenched bureaucracy and powers that be in New York real estate and New York politics.
Well, it's a funny thing. We finished PS 234 and had dinner with a small group. I was actually asked to be a committee chair on an AIA committee to rebuild. And I sat in on several meetings, and there were the most sort of circuitous grand plans that had to do with long-term infrastructure and rebuilding the entire city. And the fact is that there were immediate wounds and needs that needed to be filled, and there was talk about inclusion and wanting it to be an inclusive process, and it wasn't an inclusive group. So we said, what is there?
It was not an inclusive group.
It was not an inclusive group. It was predominantly a white, rich, corporate group that was not representative of the city.
Shocking.
Yeah, surprising. So Rick and Liz and Kevin and I came up with the idea of the city actually approached us. We first approached the city about Pier 94 was what happened. We saw how PS 234 worked. The families, the victims of the families were going to this pier that was incredibly dehumanizing.
On the Hudson River.
Yeah. And the city actually, through Tim Zagat initially, and then through Christine Nicholas, and then we got to Giuliani, said, you know, we don't want to do anything with Pier 94 right now, but we have an observation platform for the families down at Ground Zero that we'd like to be a more dignified experience for the families and a way to protect it from the weather. So I went down there with Rick and Liz and Kevin, and I've got to say, it was the most moving experience of my life. It was devastating to see this simple plywood platform with a rail around it where the families, victims, had left notes to them. And there was no mediation between us and the experience. There was no filter. And I remembered on September 11th, on 14th Street, the roof of our building, we can see the World Trade Towers prominently. And I saw the first building collapse from a conference room on the 8th floor and a TV that we had set up. And then everyone was up on the roof, so I ran up there, and it was amazing how much harder it was to believe in real life than it was on TV. There was something about the comfort of the filter and how much information was between us and the experience. So seeing this in a very simple, dignified way was a very powerful experience. So we went back to the city and said, well, we're not particularly interested in the upgrade of this as a VIP platform, but we've spent some time down there, and at the same time, the city had this need. They were looking for a solution to deal with 30 or 40,000 people a day who were going down there that had nowhere to go, and there was no way to deal with the traffic around the site. So dealing with it as just an immediate master plan, there had to be a way to get people to move around this site.
But then you had to figure out a way to, and we will skip over the insanely tedious process of getting permits and getting everybody on board, but simply funding this thing. It looks like, a fairly simple thing, but this was a $500,000 project.
Well, we knew that if it wasn't privately funded, it wasn't going to happen. And we also, frankly, knew that if it didn't happen by the end of the Giuliani administration, then everyone who we were dealing with at DOT and the police department and all of we were meeting with 20 or 30 people with the city at a time, and it was set up by the Office of Emergency Management. This incredible act on their part, because they really wanted this, and they sensed that this needed to happen.
And there was this ticking clock, because Giuliani was obviously out 3 months after the
Yeah. So the first thing we had to do was find a way to get this. We had to work with the families of the victims through the city to make sure that they knew this was happening, because this didn't want to be a surprise. And we also had to be as under the radar screen as we could be in New York, because the key was not raising a lot of objection and sort of working as quietly as possible. We came up with the idea of setting up a foundation, mainly because when we found a contractor who would build this, he would not agree to do this even if we would pay him the money. There needed to be a foundation in place. So we came up with a foundation, and actually what happened was one major developer in New York,
who shall remain nameless, I guess.
Yeah, his initials are JS, and he owns Rockefeller Center, if that helps anyone. Volunteered to help, and we met with him. The prices from the contractors were in between $500,000 to $700,000. And Atlantic Height, who's the largest scaffolding contractor in the country, volunteered to do it at cost. And so this developer said, you know what, we'll underwrite the entire expense. And we said, that's incredible. And I think this was the 21st, and we knew this had to be built and up by the 28th. And we had to start construction the next day. We had a meeting that evening with his contractor of choice, and the contractor showed up with the drawings of the platform about half the size that we had drawn it.
Sort of like the Spinal Tap scene, where you get the tiny little Stonehenge, I guess.
Well, in fact, it was as if this was going to be window washing scaffolding. There was no sense of the fact that this is next to St. Paul, that this is really a place that needs to be kind of dignified and a place to reflect and remember. And I've got to say that we spent a lot of time in putting this together, watching the crowds that gathered at St. Paul, which is just to the right, and moving around the site. And I live down there, so we spent a lot of time looking at the need. And I think people were amazed at two things. I think they were amazed at the destruction, but I think there was a sense of disbelief about the heroics of New Yorkers that I found very moving, just the sort of everyday heroics of New Yorkers. So we were in this meeting, and the contractor literally said, I'm going to lock the door because this developer will not agree to have you leave till you signed off on this. And we said, well, this is half the size. It doesn't have any of the design features that have been agreed upon by everyone in the city. We'd have to go back to the beginning to do this. And I convinced him that we should leave the room with the agreement to build it as designed. The next day, I got an email from the developer saying that he was withdrawing all funding. So we didn't know what to do, but we decided to cast a very wide net. We emailed out letters to as many people as we could. Several people in the audience here who were very helpful.
There was no thought of abandoning ship at that point?
No, we in fact, I told the contractor to go ahead. He had already ordered materials based on my go-ahead. We knew that one way or another this was going to happen, and we just felt it had to happen.
And you're funding it yourself and with contributions and this foundation. Is Richard, I think very correctly, made the point at the beginning of the, before all the chair designers came out, about the history of chair designers imposing aesthetic solutions on this kind of universal, banal, common problem of sitting. Seems to me with this, it was the opposite of that, because this was an unprecedented, singular design problem.
Well, here's the issue. We knew that this was not in the sense of when we think about the site and think about the need for memorial, it was important that this not be categorized as a memorial, that this was a place for people to reflect, to remember, a kind of quiet place. So it led us to using design solutions that created as few filters between the viewer, as we said about the Families platform, and the experience as possible. It's all incredibly humble material. It's scaffolding and plywood. And it allows, by sort of the procession of the movement up by St. Paul's and down the other side, it gives you about 300 feet to go up 13 feet from the ground to where you get this 360-degree view. But the design was driven by a need to be quick, cheap, safe, respectful, flexible. One of the other things is this is designed to be movable, because when we looked at the 4 platforms around the site, one of which is an upgrade of the Families platform, we knew that these had to be movable to respond to changing conditions and the changing definition of what Ground Zero is.
Your work, and we've talked about this before, a lot of your work, I think, is informed by your belief in, or your focus on, the temporariness of all things and the evanescence of things, and a kind of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die sort of sense of existence. This is clearly not a work for the ages. A couple of years, this thing isn't going to be here. Was that a whole new, did that require, as an architect, a new way of thinking about what you were doing, to think of it as this purely temporary installation?
No, I don't think so. I think this is obviously substantially different from anything we'd ever thought about doing before, just by the nature of it. Where it overlaps with thoughts thoughts about our work in general is, number one, the notion of collaboration is a sort of way to get things done. And Kevin Kennan, Rick Scafidio and Liz Diller, and all the people within the city, Norman Lear, who I spoke to 4 hours before our deadline for funding, offered to give us a bridge loan to help us get through it. So the notion of collaboration, I think this reinforces how important that is. And in terms of the temporary nature of it, our goal was not to create something that would be there longer than it needed to be. I think what we were most interested in is promoting a kind of dialogue that we felt may not have been happening enough in the city about what's really happening there. And the day or two before it opened was Giuliani's farewell address, where he proposed the idea of all of Ground Zero being a memorial, which was very controversial, but it resonated with a lot of people. And I think regardless of what the position is about how this sacred piece of land is to be used, having it come out of actually seeing it in a real encounter, I think makes it a more powerful dialogue. And that's what we were interested in. So that very much is in the realm of things I've been interested in before.
Yeah, no, this thing is, it seems to me, among other things, is a lovely piece of civic infrastructure, enables that conversation to get serious. And 6 months after the fact, and only a few months away from the site being cleaned, we are very quickly now getting to the point where those conversations about what should go there are getting serious. Do you have, having been as physically involved with the site as you have been doing this project, have any ideas about what should or shouldn't be done?
Well, I think one thing that shouldn't be done is evaluate. I think right now the discussion is a very closed discussion on the master plan. And there's, the ProTech Gallery recently had a show on ideas for buildings, which had some sort of inventive ideas of buildings.
And some really terrible ideas.
So, and it also felt a little bit like a kind of competition of ideas, where I think the focus of ideas should be on master planning and uses. And I think there should be a broader, and which there's starting to be, the dialogue is really opening up to what does this site really want to be. And I truly believe until the issue of memorial is sorted out, that it's going to be very hard to have an intelligent discussion. There's a few discussions right now that I think are very positive about depressing the West Side Highway and connecting this over so that there's one interrupted piece of land.
Well, I think that's interesting, and it gets to another issue that was probably inappropriate to discuss 6 months ago, but perhaps isn't now, which is not many of us love the World Trade Center as a piece of architecture, as what it had done to the city, and that huge plaza. Is this an opportunity? Is the silver lining, a silver lining here to rebuild some more traditional city grid, or not?
I think there's a real opportunity to engage in a discussion of why we live in cities. And why do we live in places where such dissimilar people collide up against us each day? And I don't think it has much to do with 50 or 60 or 70 or 80,000 new office spaces, regardless of what the number is. So yeah, I think there is a chance to relook at how we think about cities. And in fact, there's a proposal on the table now for building number 7.
Which was the building just north of the towers.
Right, which the towers fell into. And the reason that's been held up is essentially by community outrage that they're not reopening the street to connect that back to the rest of the city. So I think a public dialogue, I think a way in which there's I'd like to see an international competition and a call for ideas for uses.
Whether it's arts, whether it's housing, whether it's what amount of shopping.
And we're looking for other things. This small foundation we put together is looking for other ways to help, including taking a small piece adjacent to the site and inviting 10 architects who currently don't have a voice in New York to do artist housing, and find other ways to encourage the discussion to be against sort of monolithic single solutions and more about a multiplicity of things.
Before we end, I know you have a piece of digital video of the experience of being on this platform.
John Kamen, who's here, actually put together a 2.5-minute piece that shows the platform in use. So I thought that would be good to end with.
That's fine.
Do you want me to talk over this a little bit? Or?
Sure, please.
We're looking from Fulton Street west. One of the tricky issues we had with the Giuliani administration is I had forgotten how anti-graffiti he was. And essentially our structure was designed to be written on.
As you say, it's not a memorial, but were you conscious of memorials, the Vietnam Memorial, those kinds of forms?
We were, we certainly did as much research as we could, and we were conscious of other memorials, and also the complexity and length of time they really take to do. Is 350 people on the committee for Oklahoma City, which is why we thought of this as a sort of ad hoc, spontaneous solution that expanded on Union Square and the places that were ad hoc memorials in the city already. The scaffolding you can see built up over the street is demountable. What's interesting now is the nature of the site has totally changed, so that what you're aware of is not just the destruction of the buildings in Ground Zero, but all of the buildings around it and the scars on the building around it, which are enormous. This shows St. Paul's on the left.
And I think, I mean, to me, and I just want to thank you on behalf of New Yorkers for making this happen and getting this done, but the kind of virtually instantaneous nature of its erection and its being there almost before you could believe that a response of this magnitude could be accomplished is part of its, I think, extraordinary, I don't know if beauty is the word, but presence.
It was an honor to do, and I'm thrilled to be able to show it here.
We are now about to start the last session of the day. The fucking Respighi brothers got me in this goddamn thing.
Well,
and I can't get out.
Well, coming to all right.
I think it's probably the best $5 grand we ever spent.
I'm gonna tell a story. Shut up. This summer, just before 9/11, through a series of contacts, I got invited through an admiral to go fly onto an aircraft carrier that was doing war games in the Atlantic, the Theodore Roosevelt. And I thought it would be really a nice experience. And I would never do that again either. It was hot, claustrophobic, noisy, scary. I had to land on the thing and then get shot off the next day in a catapult. Halfway into this, I got claustrophobia and I couldn't move. And now I'm sweating. And I don't want to miss any of the program. It's probably going to take me a few hours to change my pants when I get out.
What a nice thought that is.
Yeah. That's a pretty picture.
Let's get this over with, guys.
Well, come on out here.
Come on out. All right.
Come on out.
Let's hear it for Richard Saul Warman. Coming out.
This is the.
All right. Well,
I happen to like sumo wrestling a lot.
When we came to TED, we had 3 goals. One was to do our presentation and hopefully entertain you during that.
Second was to create a brand new musical instrument.
And third, to beat Richard with bats. So to that end, we've created Richard Saul Warman in the sumo phone.
It's not quite a 17th century cello.
There you go.
But okay, here's how it works. We're going to start and just do a quick, just show you how it works.
Little scale. Oops, you got to restart the.
Yeah, let me see if it's
all, right.
all turned on. It's
comfortable? Oh wait, well, something's missing. All right. There you go. All right. How's that look? There. That's nice. That's a good look for you. All right. So we're going to start with a simple scale. As you can see, there are 8 pads on the front. Each one represents 1 note on the octave.
And then on the back we have 4. Those are the.
These are the accidentals,
yep.
which is all you musicians know. These are the notes musicians hit by mistake.
Okay.
Ready?
Let's see if we. Okay. Okay, that's how it works.
All right, that's the sumo phone. Now we'll start with a simple American folk tune.
American folk tune, just to.
This is going to be very quick, guys.
Yeah, we're good.
What time does this session end?
It's almost over.
Ooh, you're scaring me.
Really? Yeah. Ooh, you big scary sumo, you. What are you gonna do? Fall on us?
Joe, I need you.
Oh, you got backup. This is good. Here we go.
All right. Ready.
Nice. That's Richard.
Oh, there you go.
Well done. Okay. Okay.
All right.
Now. What's that? Keep going?
No, now. Out.
Oh, really? There's one more song.
Just, this will be a nice song for you.
Okay.
No.
You okay?
This is a tribute song.
All right. Okay. Now give us some help on this next song because it's a tribute. You'll catch on. Here we go. Ready.
Nice.
All right, one last song. One last one.
One more?
No.
One last one. This is the end. This is the end.
This is it.
This is it. One.